Sir, to start this debate proper.
Yeah. Members of this House, the islands of Maldives and Bangladesh are sinking fast, all because of climate change. And if nothing if nothing immediate is done, primarily by the first world countries, we say the problem is only going to get worse. This is the reason why we believe industrialized nations should be forced to accept these climate change refugees, because we say that it's not their fault that this is happening to them, and more importantly, for industrialized nations, as global citizens, have the moral obligation to do this, especially to set a good example in the long run. We on opening government are going to prove two things. First, on why the first world should do this, and then do this immediately. And second, why it is principally correct to do so. So how exactly are we going to address the problem? We're going to do it through this proposal. First, we will implement this in the UN, where countries who are being affected by climate change, say for instance Maldives or Bangladesh, can submit a proposal to the UNHCR, please sit down, on if they can request if the first world can receive these refugees. Upon agreement of this proposal, we say that they are obliged to take a minimum amount of refugees from these afflicted countries. Furthermore, we say that the local governments should also play a part in this, and must do their best in cooperation with the first world nations to reduce pollution and to reduce the effects of climate change. Furthermore, we say that other policies such as clean up or research into these into climate change and pollution control are not mutually exclusive to our proposal, and we'll still pursue this at the end of the day. Now, why exactly do we argue for this? First, I'm going to tell you why the first world is the primary culprit of climate change. First of all, how did climate change come about in the first place? If you remember, around in the early 20th century, the Industrial Revolution happened. This is when people started to pollute. This is when people started to burn coal at a faster rate. This is when people started, please sit down. When people discovered fossil fuel and realized that they can burn it as much as they want to produce, please sit down, to industrialize. We say that the Industrial Revolution is where this pollution actually happened, and the effects of this pollution is what we see now. Because of this, we say that the effects of pollution, especially what happened in the past, are never localized. Let's look at the example of Maldives and Bangladesh, which are sinking right now, and whose coastal areas are now being affected and are considered inhospitable. Let's look at the example of Let's look at the example of China, where they have to spend $20 billion to fight against soil erosion because of climate change. We say at the end of the day, these who are affected, these climate change refugees who are affected, have nowhere else to go. It's not necessarily their fault that their farmland has become inhospitable or due to climate change. And at the end of the day, we say, because the first world countries are primarily responsible for that happening to them, we say that they should be the ones taking charge and therefore take these refugees in at the end of the day. But before I move on, yes.
So do you agree that these industrializing nations as well, the developing nations such as Bangladesh and Maldives, are also responsible for such climate change?
First of all, we say that the climate change we're experiencing now is primarily the result of the first world. But we do agree that the local government should participate in pollution control as well. We say that if, let's say, in the future, countries such as China become more responsible for pollution control, then fine. We add them to the proposal later on. But now let's go back to the proposal. The opposition might just say that, it's an expensive thing. Then nobody sit down. Then you're overburdening nations at the end of the day. Well, just because it's expensive doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't do it. Because first of all, there is proof that the first world is actually culpable. Second, the damage is experienced by the most vulnerable of parties. In this case, poor coastal communities, poor farming communities. And given that when they have nothing else to go back to. Because of these reasons, because the first world is culpable, and these first world countries have a moral obligation to those they have unjustly wronged in the present day, we say that in response to this global issue, there has to be a global initiative. And one way of doing so is please sit down. And the best way of doing so is forcing them to accept climate change refugees. Furthermore, we say, you know what, they might they might say, why, what about these refugees leeching off the parent states? We say that's not gonna happen because we said in our proposal that, you know what, we at first they might be at refugee camps, but they can easily apply for permanent residence or citizenship at the end of the day. So we see these industrialized nations can even benefit from these refugees as compared to these people staying in a place where the land is inhospitable. We say at the end of the day that this proposal must be forwarded. No, please sit down. On my second argument, I'm going to talk to you about why this is essentially principally correct. Aside from them being culpable, it is we must charge the global impetus to stop climate change and giving the responsibility first to those who are most responsible for it, or no, please sit down, or the ones who are most capable of addressing the issue. Let's look at the case of industrialized nations like the US or the UK. We say that these countries have the largest GDP per capita in the world, which means we say that compared to countries like China, who have a lot of people to support, we say that these people are more capable. These citizens are more capable to take the burden of this pollution issue. We are not necessarily saying that everyone should work towards it, but we're saying that the primary responsibility should rely on the people, no, please sit down, who are more capable of handling the issue. Because we say investment into green technology is something that at present is still very expensive, but we say is necessary, especially when the social cost of pollution goes on a global scale, and the social costs and the environmental costs and the economic costs of pollution are becoming more widespread and are becoming exponentially worse. So what I've been talking about in the last couple of minutes, I've explained to you why we should do it, particularly why we should do it now, to prevent disasters from happening in the future, and more importantly, I've discussed to you why there's a global impetus now to actually forward this movement. Because we say, when it comes to a global issue, we say that when there is a global issue, there should be a global response, and it should be spearheaded by those who have benefited most from polluting, which are these first world industrialized nations. We say at the end of the day, they were given the opportunity to pollute, and now they must give back to promote, first of all, sustainable development of the Earth's resources, given that carrying capacity is not as great as before. And we say at the end of the day, we stand by our principles, we stand by protecting the environment, and therefore this proposal must pass. Thank you.
Okay.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech and call upon Leader of Opposition to start the side opposition. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I think it is regrettable that many of the things that we see for Maldives and Bangladesh, in fact many of these islands, Seychelles as well, we think that this is a real problem. But we think that they have on their side, on opening government, falsely characterized the type of responsibility that needed to be imputed on the whole world and not just this industrialized nation. Because they, in their same breath, mentioned how the world needs to take a cohesive action, but in that token, actually pinpointed the industrialized nations and tried to circumscribe all the problems onto them, and we don't think that is exactly fair. And basically, they have came out and said one thing, right? That the first world nation should be the only people accepting all these climate change refugees just because there's money. And this, on many levels, is not true, and I'll show you why and how much of the policy, much of the paradigm that we're supporting is actually going to be much more beneficial. So I'll be talking to you, number one, firstly, on the idea of responsibility in global sharing, and number two, I'll be later showing you how you unfairly impute the responsibility onto these industrialized nations, and then number three, I'll be talking to you about the difficulty of how these refugees actually assimilate in all those societies, right? Okay, first of all, they said that these climate change problems are actually evident and actually caused by all these industrialized nations in the 1990s, right? And that's what exactly he says, that if you burn coal and all these things start happening. Okay, firstly, we don't think that it was a causal link there. We think that islands have been sinking even before you created all these core industrial energy. But even if such a situation was true, would you not then consider the fact that two major big players like India and China, whom are major burners of coal, are supposed to take in all these countries as well, right? And not just the first world industrialized nation that you try to put all the blame to. We don't think that is fair. And in fact, these are the correct places to put these people in, and here's why, right? Because they have the abundance of land and a lot and much more job opportunities than what is already in a saturated first world nation. And what's more is that if you put somebody who is in a culturally and geographically similar location, you are bound to get a better assimilation for these people. And we think that is a good thing. It actually accelerates these people into joining in society, and this is why it is actually better for the whole world in general. So let me move on to talk about a few things. No, thank you, sir. Alright, and I'll be showing to you how you unfairly impute the responsibility on these industrialized nations. Okay, first of all, we think that you have failed to address the idea of sovereignty. Understanding that if you put all, like I'm talking about sovereignty for this industrialized nation specifically, right? But we think that in a global context, then you address sovereignty, because if everybody through the UN framework that you push forward across makes people recognize that their global contribution is basically about recognizing their own society's needs. In that situation, what you actually have is that every society now recognizes that they need to make some sacrifice. But if you unfairly impute this huge responsibility on the likes of France, Germany, and the UK and the US, then you're saying all your sovereignty does not belong. We don't think that was going to work in the UN in the first place. We don't think that you stood for reality. And then later they said that, well, yeah, you said that, well, it's easy to push all these people there. But wait, the problem with this, right, is that you actually stigmatize all the people that eventually get to these first world nations from these climate change countries. We think that that's not a good thing, and we think that that is something very undesirable, and that will be explained more later. But let me talk about, no thank you sir, let me talk more about the difficulty of the refugee assimilation and in their idea, okay? The problem with their paradigm is that they're trying to put very different, completely very fundamentally different people into the likes of the UK, France, and Italy. And what happens then is that xenophobia is bound to grow. Just as you see in the situation of how Libya citizens trying to go to Italy, and much of the people from Bangladesh trying to move over to first world nations like Singapore as well. I'll take opening.
So, do you think that the lives of Americans are more valuable than the lives of people in Africa?
No, I don't think so. But I think that the lives of Africans are equal to the lives of everybody in the world, and that is why they should share a similar responsibility. And that is the paradigm that we support. So, but let me show you more on why this refugee problem is going to exacerbate on their side. Because they're saying that put all these people into a select few countries. So basically what happens is a lot of overcrowding. But what is the problem of this overcrowding? Is that you accelerate the trend of ghettoization, and you accelerate the self-reliance of these communities. And when these communities become self-reliant, especially the Muslim communities like in the UK, what happens is that it is harder to regulate and monitor the illegal activities that goes in there, because they generally try to crowd out and shout out the legal powers of that society that's available in that country. So we think that there, on that count, it is actually very difficult to give the refugees true assimilation. But then let me move on and develop what is exactly going to happen to all these climate change refugees, right? And it's not just countries who are sinking. There are countries who are suffering from a lot of these different typhoons and hurricanes and all these things. We think that primarily, if you took off all the blame of them, what's going to happen is that the people, when they take flight, would eventually be a sole reason of all these countries saying that, well, we don't have to do anything more just because all these people are going to better places. We don't think that should be a desirable effect. We think that if anything, if you want a true rebuilding process for your country, you will do much more to anticipate for the effects of the future, knowing that in your country you are in a geographically sensitive region, you will do more to build for the people. And that is why many people in Japan, right, still stay in their city, because the city accommodates for the future environmental impact that happens to them. And that is the thing, that's the kind of responsibility that we want. But in your paradigm, you shift all the burden away from these countries. Why? Because you're saying that if if something happens to this part of the country, like Banda Aceh, then you never had to develop it, but simply because your refugees are going to a better place. And we think that's no good. Because in the long run, all your refugees then don't show the necessary responsibility in taking up the rebuilding process. They don't show the necessary willpower and the long-term planning. For all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech and call upon Deputy Prime Minister to continue for opening government.
Mr. Speaker, Kana ate 14 slices of pizza during lunch and it directly contributed to climate change. But that's nothing to do with this debate today, or maybe just to a small extent. We think this debate really lies on the idea where the first world countries primarily or absolutely share the responsibility of global climate change. And we think from side opening government, our stance is clear and simple. Yes, we think the responsibility lies with them. Let's make it clear one more time. We're not saying that developing countries or countries that are affected absorb all forms of duty. We think it was very clear highlighted in Douglas' speech when he said that, well, countries on their own will try and mitigate for their own best interest the kinds of extent that they have. So we think some of Jeremy's arguments fair. But let's respond to the three things that he talked about even further, right? Firstly, this wacky idea that people will now be more incentivized to pollute because governments say, hey, my people are going to a better place. Well, firstly, the first response is, no, we don't think so, because in our policy, we think that you can't expect have millions of people flooding in your countries at one time. We think that the process is gradual, and his policy in when Douglas speech, he said that we are going to take the places where it's the most affected by pollution and by climate change itself, where places are inhospitable because your house is underwater. We think that's very clear. We don't think the numbers are going to be huge. We think there will be some kind of procedure that goes through carefully. But secondly, we also say it's the interest of these governments to try and clean up their own countries, right? Because we don't think governments want to run a country without anyone. But more importantly, we tell you that governments do have that kind of moral obligation, something we're not washing our hands off. Second response to this argument, right? They think this concept of absolute sovereignty. Well, let's explain what this concept of sovereignty really is. Because firstly, we say that the idea that sovereignty just lies beyond your borders or within your borders is a concept that's dreadfully dead. Ask Israel about that in Syria, right? But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that at the end of the day, pollution isn't something that's just confined to your own territories. We think that's very clear because there's no way in hell for any country to keep the kind of carbon monoxide that's just within their own borders itself, right? Borders itself, right? Which is why we tell you that at the end of the day, if you're talking about the sovereignty of these countries, then what about the sovereignty of Bangladesh or Ghana, who didn't ask for carbon monoxide to float into their countries and affect their livelihood and erode their soil and pollute their waters, Mr. Speaker? We think that kind of questions must be answered, the hard truths from opening opposition itself, never answered by their side. But thirdly, we said this concept of sovereignty is slowly eroding by the fact that global responsibility, something Douglas talked about, must be shared around the entire global community. We think that concept is clear. For example, no, hang on guys, don't get too excited. For example, you see how countries are more than willing to take asylum seekers because they feel that there's some kind of moral obligation that they have towards the lives of other people and the quality of life that they're suffering to. That it's not right for people to have a McDonald's 3 times a day, like Hannah sit down, and while other people are starving in other countries. That kind of moral obligation is no longer confided to your own borders, Mr. Speaker. We think responsibility must now lie to others in other different forms. While the form might change, but the function is still the same. Everything is clear when it comes to global warming itself. Third response to Jeremy's case. Why then does it primarily lie with the first world? Because it's the only contention. If you listen to the argument from OO, right, they're perfectly fine with responsibility being shared. That means there are in principle agreement to a case. But they just say, well, let's just spread it out a little bit more. We think Douglas did that already in his speech, right? He told you how the Industrial Revolution was the primary cause. We don't think global warming is something that's being done overnight. So if you use the yardsticks of China and India right now, it's unfair. But I'll get to that later on, right? But more importantly, we say that global warming is something something of an accumulation over many, many decades, Mr. Speaker. If you see how developing countries only started to develop, aka China in the 1970s, India, aka in the 1990s. If you look at it from the perspective of the West, they've been burning coal like hell since the 1800s itself. You look across the accumulated spectrum of time, we don't think of the responsibility. We sure do agree that China and India has some responsibility. So does the individual nations. So does Singapore. But we think that the bulk of the blame lies on the countries that have solely benefited from this without sharing the benefits of the industrial revolution to these other countries. So we think it is very fair when America consumes or burns off 77 cubic meters of pollution each day as compared to someone in China who burns 9. We think that the kind of proportionality you're talking about solely and squarely lies on developed countries and not developing countries itself. So we think at the end of the day, we've outlined our arguments really clear. They haven't come up with a good justification for that. But let me talk to you about what I'm going to bring about. But before I take closing.
Ultimately, sir, you have to understand that when the Industrial Revolution was happening, there was no way that they could predict that climate change would possibly ever be a problem 50 years down the road. There's an unfair moral obligation that they're giving these individuals.
Yeah, and sure that the British didn't foresee that colonizing half the world would create a lot of problems. We don't think that foresight is an excuse. We think if you've done something wrong, bear the consequences and deal with it, Kana. For this, we just sit down. Right? Now, let's go on to my arguments in this debate. I have one basic idea about why at the end of the day this compel governments to clean up the act. Because that's what they're talking about. What we think is best achieved when you have some kind of a visible push from the people itself. Let's get the facts right. In 2001, George W. Bush stood up to the world for the Kyoto Protocol and said the American lives will not be compromised. We think it's a shame that George W. Bush prioritizes the lives of Americans over everyone else. But we think it's a greater shame that citizens themselves do not recognize the fact that the responsibilities that they conduct are they are responsible to the other people around the world. We think that citizens are ultimately, at the end of the day, the final accountability to governments itself, right? And as long as you don't bring the kind of real and tangible problems to these countries itself, right, people don't see a need to change their life. That's why George W. Bush got away with making such a statement, because American citizens could never see visually, right, how climate change was affecting the world, right? Not only because they don't watch television that are good for them, but at the same time sit down. At the same time, they think that the lives that they're having are extremely comfortable and that there's no disturbance to themselves. So there's no moral impetus to push them to make the governments more accountable and become and to help the others, right? But when you put these refugees within these countries itself, when you make these refugees within their borders, it becomes a very touchy and uncomfortable issue. And we want people to feel like that, right? Because we think that's precisely what makes people act and what makes people tell governments, hey, these people are here. Maybe it's partially because of our fault, or maybe we don't feel comfortable with having refugees. Is there a way to avoid it? And the answer is yes, right? If governments then put their act together, which we think that things like Kyoto Protocol has stopped for way too long, right? Something that the US refuses to sign. We think that makes people push governments harder to say, hey, let's do something about it. It's very clear and evident why the first world countries don't feel any responsibility. That's why someone who's pro-environment like Barack Obama recently refuted the environment bill to make cars more efficient, right? Because people don't see a need to do so. But their side and our side also at the same time accepts that something must be done to save the world and to save the environment. The question is, what are they doing about it? We clearly told you, Mr. Speaker, that at the end of the day, we make citizens compelled to push the governments to act, make governments to work together harder to have a more viable option, right? And at the same time, we think that this make this policy fair and clear. We're not going to open our gates to many people at the same time. We're going to make it fair and proportion. We think it's time that the first world countries reap what they sow in terms of benefits as well as responsibilities.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech and call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition.
It's very easy for Syed to come and blame like developed nations for everything. We don't think that is the way to go forward. They can in no way really prove that it was the Industrial Revolution which caused this climate change. our stance on opening opposition was very clearly that despite the fact that both industrialized and industrializing nations are causing this problem, we as a global community need to solve it together rather than playing a blame game and saying that the sole responsibility lies with these industrialized nations. We give you a number of problems with this, things I'll be elaborating to you more in my speech. The new matter that I'll be giving to you is firstly how developing nations are going to react to this and how it removes any responsibility from them. And secondly, I'll be talking to you about how industrialized nations really don't have the resources to sustain so many people at this point in time. We think their policy does a huge amount of harm to that. But before that, let's look into 6 rebuttals. Firstly, let's look at the incentive of these developing nations, because he came and told us that, look, apparently Jeremy came and told that these countries have more of an incentive to pollute. We don't really think they have more of an incentive to pollute, but we think that they have a less of an incentive to rehabilitate these people and make an effort in their own countries to make sure that these regions are more rehabilitative, are more sustainable for their own people and lead to less problems. We think that ultimately, when you go and give them an easy way out and tell them that when your people are suffering, then just move them to another country because it is those guys' faults anyway, we think their own countries have absolutely no incentive to go in and plan their own country, to go in and have an incentive to make sure that their people are okay. We think it's very easy for them to just say, you guys are climate change refugees, let's just move you off to the developed nations. And let's look at the second idea of sovereignty. Because he came and told us that, look, sovereignty is not an absolute idea. We think that when you flood millions of refugees into another country, you are completely violating the sovereignty of that nation. We think that increasingly more and more countries are getting affected by climate change. Even though they came and gave us 2 examples of Maldives and Bangladesh, we think there are plenty of other islands out there which might be sinking in the future. We don't think you can completely say, let's just remove everyone and put them into these developed nations. We think that these countries have their own sovereignty to speak of and they need to be acceptable to taking in these people. Which is why we think that status quo for taking in refugees is just as well fine. We think that the fact that you need to apply for a refugee status and prove that you are to be taken in on a need-based status and that you are completely suffering under those circumstances and that you really can't live in your country is what should be acceptable. We don't think their policy really goes for that. And then let's look at this idea of the difference between an asylum seeker and these climate change refugees, because we think these asylum seekers are people who are completely persecuted in their countries and can absolutely not live in that nation, cannot live in the circumstances with which they are living in their nation. We think that these people who are affected by climate change can be relocated within their own nation. There can be other measures which can be taken. Like, look at the coastal regions of Bangladesh, right? You can relocate the people from there into the hearts of Bangladesh. You can relocate people into other places as well to make sure that they are sustainable within their own nation. We think that ultimately there is a difference between an asylum seeker and climate change refugees. We don't want to open up another area for people to just have an excuse and say, we are a refugee, please take us in. And then the next idea is, whose fault really is it? Because we think that ultimately when they come and tell us the direct cause is only the Industrial Revolution, we think that's completely false. We think that in status quo, it is China which burns much more coal than the USA. The fact that these industrialized nations have done it in the past doesn't mean that it is their fault completely. We think that ultimately the whole world should share this problem together. It's a global problem and we need to look for a global solution for it rather than playing a blame game. Then the last rebuttal is, who does the government owe this duty of care to? Because we think that ultimately, when Syed didn't respond to this entire idea of cultural assimilation from Jeremy, the problem which he is ignoring is, when you take in a huge number of people who don't fit into your nation, then what really happens is that their own people are going to be completely against that sort of idea. It's going to promote xenophobia. It's going to lead to a lot more problems in the cultural assimilation of these people. That means that the people of your own nation are unhappy. That means these climate change refugees are also unhappy because they're no longer able to assimilate in that community. It's going to lead to more clusterization within your own communities, things which we've seen in these developed nations who have a tendency to do so. We think that ultimately the duty of care of the US government is primarily to its own people. The fact that they give aid and support to other nations is good and we want to encourage that, but we think that beyond everything, you firstly need to make sure that your own people are okay, that your own people are able to survive, and then you move on with the rest of the world. We think that globally, if you say that you need to deal with this problem, then everyone comes together, but when you say it's solely your problem, then it's very, very hard to do that. Before I move on, I'll take close.
Which is the better scenario? The fact that people in Mauritius will die if you do nothing, or the assumption that there will be some xenophobic reaction?
We think that people in Maldives are not going to die immediately. You need to accept the fact that there is some amount of planning that needs to be done. Look at nations such as Mauritius who actually bought land in Australia so that they can relocate to that nation. We think that those are the kind of initiatives which you really want to encourage. The fact that these countries make an effort of their own rather than putting the blame onto other nations and just saying that you go ahead and just relocate over there. We think that ultimately you need to see what is a sustainable solution, because you can't really move everyone that you feel is going to get affected by climate change into these developed nations. We think these developed nations are also getting affected by climate change. We see hurricanes hitting USA as well and them getting very affected by them. Look at Hurricane Katrina. It took them years to rebuild that community as well. We think it is a global problem which everyone needs to face together. So then let's look into this idea of the responsibility of developing nations. And this is what we want to bring out to you, this idea of a blame game. Because we think under their side, when you completely blame these industrialized nations, then no one is really going to win. Because it's going to de-incentivize these industrialized nations from doing anything, and it's going to de-incentivize these developing nations also from doing anything. Let me show you how, right? Because these developing nations absolutely don't have any incentive for doing anything for the better of their own country, for having any foresight in the development of their own country, because they're just going to keep on industrializing, they're just going to keep on developing and burning that coal without seeing what effects it has on its own nation, because they know that if there is some effect, we can just blame that industrialized nation and say, you go ahead and deal with it. We think from the industrialized nations' parts as well, it reduces their support into other initiatives, things such as clean energy, things such as, giving aid to these countries as well. We think it reduces the sort of support you have within your own country for it. We think that the USA is progressing quite a bit under Obama to go ahead and enforce these measures, and we think it's important that it does continue. We think the European Union has done far a lot to ensure that clean energy goes into the world, and we think you're de-incentivizing them from these measures because you're taking away their resources and making them spend it on those climate change refugees. You're really blaming them for things which they're not responsible for. The last idea that industrialized nations don't really have the resources. Like, face it, look at the world. The US is under a debt crisis. The EU is already dying under bond circumstances. We think they don't have the resources to deal with 1 million people coming into the nation and saying we are refugees. I think it's very simple that this is a global problem which needs to be dealt with like a global community. There's no point of playing a blame game. There's no principle behind this idea as well. We think we need to go forward and make sure that the world is able to sustain it by dealing with it as a global community. We're very, very proud to oppose.
Order please. I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition, and now to start the closing half of this debate, I invite the Member of Government.
Madam Speaker, today before I move on to my extension of how this will help us gain political capital in poorer countries, which is going to be my major extension. Before that, several points of rebuttal, Madam Speaker, to what Shweta and Jeremy both had to say. Right? On the first level, they put people dying and xenophobia, and they tried to compare it. Oh, which is greater, people dying or xenophobia, right? And the answer is very evident, right? People dying is a greater immediate threat, and as bastions of humanity, right? And as Western liberal democracies, our priority should be saving people who are dying and not controlling xenophobia, right? So they've got that principle wrong on the first place. Secondly, so let's assume that these poor countries and developing countries like Maldives, Mauritius are responsible for climate change. I'm assuming but not conceding to the fact that they have a stake to play, right? Even if that's the case, if they can't mitigate the situation and if they can't take care of the people who are dying, then isn't it basic humanitarian principle of the Western liberal democracies to accept them anyway, right? So we really don't see what the problem is on that side of the house. If they aren't able to mitigate their own problems, what the problem is, as humanitarian principles, as bastions of humanity, again, Western liberal democracies should take in these people solely under humanitarian criteria, if not anything else. Right? Sit down. And then they talked about how the Western liberal democracies is like some utopian state, right, where everyone wants to bloody rush and go. Please tell you that this is not the case, right? People in Mauritius and Maldives would much rather live in their own territory, where they've been born and brought up, not just migrate to the United States, right? So when they don't have a way to ask, if there is a local recourse, if there is a chance that they can be rehabilitated in their own country, we're perfectly fine with that. All we're asking is, in case of dire states, in case we can't solve this problem, then the developed nations should accept them as it is a moral responsibility, as opening has already pointed out to you. Right? So,
Sir, before
so
that.
before I move on to my extension, I'll take over.
Yeah, we think dying people is a really bad thing. But the fact that these dying people should be channeled to all over the world and not just this industrialized nations is something of a global responsibility that we have talked about, right?
Yeah, hold on. So firstly, this was already brought down by opening up, but I think Jeremy didn't understand what they said.
Yes.
But opening up already told you that that as in when he said that India and China should take in refugees, in principle they're already okay with infringing on the so-called sovereignty of nations. They're okay with the refugees going to India and China, but they're not okay with them migrating to Western liberal democracies. Double standards, ladies and gentlemen. Right? So let's move on to my extension of how this will help us gain political capital in poorer countries on two levels. Right? First, let me give you background. Well, let me give you some background on the climate change issues, and then I'll move on to analyze why it's important for us to gain this political capital in poorer countries. Right? So, over the decades, we've had many conferences, we've had many protocols, the Kyoto Protocol, the Montreal Protocol. I don't know much about this. Gadre is environmentalist. He's an expert on this. Right? So I don't know much about this, but Kyoto Protocol, all I know is there's a dissent, right? A very, very tangible dissent between the developing world and the first world. We've seen this. We've seen many protocols going down the drain because of this dissent. Let's analyze why this dissent exists in the first place, right? First, the developing nations see the Western liberal democracies as hypocrites who talk and do nothing, right? The poorer countries view them as people who just want to enforce these actions on other people but take no action themselves, right? Because they're too busy solving their bloody debt crisis most of the time and they can't solve other issues. Right? So the West is seen as doing nothing, and this in turn disincentivizes these people from taking any action, which is why you see that countries like India and China don't give a damn about climate change. They have more immediate pressing concerns, and that's why they're not incentivized to take action against environmental and climate change, right? So now what happens if these refugees, happens if the Western liberal democracies take the step forward, right? Lead from the front and accept refugees. Now the developing world is like, look, the US is doing something. Look, France is doing something. Germany is doing something. They're actually taking responsibility for their actions. They're taking a proactive role in mitigating the crisis that exists throughout the world, right? And that's when they appreciate and realize the magnitude of this problem, ladies and gentlemen, which they till now haven't realized because of various issues, because the West is seen as hypocritical and West is seen as taking no proactive action. Now, when the West actually takes this burden upon itself, right, sacrifices something for the rest of the world, which the West never does, right? So when it does this for the first time in history, right, the developing nations actually realize and appreciate how big a problem this is, right? And we tell you why it's important for these developing nations to realize this. We see that today's poor or developing nations, right? Look at India, look at China, look at Brazil. They're the next US, France, Germany of the world. They're going to be burning a lot of coal. They're going to be using up a lot of resources. That they're going to be the economic superpowers of tomorrow. And and looking at the macro perspective, these are the guys who are going to be polluting the world tomorrow. So we tell you, Mr. Speaker, it's very important that these people who are going to be responsible for most of the pollution understand the magnitude of the situation and act on it. So we need people in India to realize that we can't be burning so much coal, right? We have to look at the environment, look at the West, look at what it's doing. We have to look at the environment, and we need to replace coal by solar, wind energy, using more renewable source of energy, which the East or the developing nations now consider absolutely fruitless, right? Before I run out of time, I'll take
Don't you think that the fact that the message that you send is that only the developed nations are the ones responsible for this problem, how is it ever going to incentivize nations such as China and India to change?
Wait, why are they disincentivized in the first place? Because they see that the West is taking no proactive action, and the truth is that the West has been taking no proactive action. You really can't blame these nations for taking no action, right? So when they see a change in the West, when they see the big brother sitting right there taking some action, right, that's when they realize the magnitude of the situation, and that's when they realize that they need to take responsibility and they need to stop using so much coal. They need to pay heed to the environment. So, right, and this really goes a long way in solving a lot of environmental crises that lay in the times ahead. If we take this action now, we, ladies and gentlemen, can ensure that as Western liberal democracy send the right message and ensure that the world doesn't end in 2014 or 2014 or 2015 or anytime soon, right? So we've told you today why in principle they're already fine, right, with accepting refugees in the first place. They haven't proven to us in principle why that shouldn't be the case. They've also conceded to the fact that people dying is a bigger threat than xenophobia, and we've told you how important it is in the macro perspective. For all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we're very proud to propose.
I thank the Member of Government for his speech and call upon Member of Opposition to start his case for site closing opposition.
I want to deal with closing government's extension in my own extension as to how this concession is extremely detrimental in any kind of influence or external influence that the international community can have over developing nations when trying to influence change from within, which in that is the most sustainable solution in trying to reach an end to this problem itself. But before that, a couple of questions I want to ask. Three, in fact. What is a sustainable solution? What's really happening in Bangladesh? And thirdly, what exactly is the duty of the Western liberal democracy to bring with? The first idea is a sustainable solution, and what exactly do we need to do to necessarily end this problem or try to make it more accommodating or try to make it something we can cope with? We think that the primary idea coming from Gulf Bench is that we cannot live with the fact that we just deport everyone which is from a country that's dying due to climate change into a country that isn't necessarily dying from a climate change itself. Because if we kept doing that, then everybody's going to die eventually anyway. There is no real sustainable solution as to how we solve the problem of climate change. In fact, their model is more of a cop-out than it is an answer to the problem of climate change itself. It doesn't solve the real problem as what do we do about the fact that the situation is getting worse besides the fact that let's just save people itself. Their model is not a sustainable solution to begin with. But secondly, this whole concept of what's really happening in Bangladesh. And that's when CG completely boycotted OO's argument by saying that xenophobia is not really as important as people are dying. Look, people are not dying right now, not because of climate change, alright? They're not likely to die in a day, a year, a week, maybe even a decade. They won't die, and it will only take like 3 decades for them to die. I'm not saying that's a very long time, but the idea is very simple. There is time. There is time for us to make sustainable policies, for adjustments, for us to make sure that these living conditions do become accommodating for the local citizens itself. We don't think the idea is that people are going to be dying next week, so we need to necessarily move people out of these countries as soon as possible. That's a very, very false characterization that they have painted. But there is this idea of Western liberal democracies, and where do their responsibilities lie? Look, ultimately, if we have a responsibility to protect everyone that's dying, if we were to assume that there is a humanitarian crisis and we have a responsibility to protect, why should the responsibility lie with just the industrialized nations itself? Ultimately, the duty to protect anyone that's dying is primarily supposed to be taken on by anyone and everyone in the world. Not just a particular sector that decides that we need to care for people more than anyone else. But the idea is that primarily all countries do have a duty of care towards their own citizens first, and it is an important consideration to take into something that their opening talked about in this debate itself. But we think we've gone to the last question in this debate. Where should the blame lie? And we think it's important for us to set standards in this debate as to how we assess blame itself. And I alluded to this in my POI, and this is where a little bit of my new matter comes in. The concept is that they want to blame a group of nations that necessarily didn't know about the effects of the Industrial Revolution itself. They didn't possibly and couldn't possibly foresee the kinds of impacts that it could have caused 50 years down the road. Are they any less liable? I don't know. But you juxtapose this with what's happening right now. Countries like South Africa, Bangladesh itself, which understand the consequences of global warming, but keep polluting in the first place. What's the problem with this? Is the fact that they continuously prioritize any form of structural development within their countries rather than go green itself. They're still using dirty mining and dirty forms of industrialization to make sure that they reach that step of development much faster than everyone else. Rather than take the aid from the West that says that go green, go have biotechnology or biofuel, grow crops that produce these things, they don't want to do that. In fact, it is more to blame, and the West, these industrializing nations are more to blame precisely because of the fact that they understand the consequences but choose to perpetuate the kind of harm and situation they're in the first place. So now we strip that all away from the government bench. The only thing they have left is that we should respond to a humanitarian crisis. Something that is in no way nuanced to the fact that it should be developed nations that do it in the first place. That's a fundamental failure on their part. Sit down. But we go on to this concept of my first extension as to why the concession is particularly harmful. And this is where I deal with the argument coming from side closing down. They tell us that hypocrisy is something that is a very big hindrance when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to people not being able to work together to solve a problem itself. They concede that fact we need a global united front, a solution, a model to solve this problem. You see, but we think that hypocrisy is the least of your worries. Because ultimately, when you do make the concession when it comes to these kinds of industrialized nations itself, is that you do two things. Number one, you put that false sense of obligation on industrialized nations when it comes to their false obligation to try and help and be the world's policemen in these issues itself. But the problem with this is very simple. Is the fact that now that the moral obligation has shifted from not just having everyone having an equal stake in this problem, but that one country has more liability than any other country in the world, negotiations become extremely difficult because that compromise will never be reached. Understanding that there is a false sense of obligation that is being present right now, developing nations itself will always use this as an advantage or an abuse to try to make sure that they will never compromise to the fact, because they understand that West or the industrialized nations have already set the moral precedent to take charge of this problem within their own hands. Why should we do any more when they themselves have conceded and they themselves have realized that they are the ones who are fully to blame for these kinds of problems itself? This kind of rhetoric will never allow both parties to come to the table, because on the first level, it will just make the developing nations feel like there is a greater moral perspective on the industrialized nations itself. But retrospective is that westernized or industrialized nations will only feel that any claims made by developing nations are completely unreasonable, and what happens then is that you push any forms of negotiations and compromise even further down than what it already is. You juxtapose hypocrisy with what could possibly happen. We think furthering and stalling negotiations even more is a much greater harm in the first place. Fact is, we need to come to a consensus very soon, but what they will do is not successfully wipe out hypocrisy. They will successfully set moral precedents of obligation from one party to another, and that's where the harm begins. And that's where we think that negotiations will never be reached in the first place. But before I go on, yes.
Do you think it's easier to make governments more accountable when the citizens themselves directly feel the pinch, or when they do it from their own comforts of their home?
We think that ultimately, if you deport everyone away, that's when the citizens don't feel the pinch in the first place. The fact is there isn't any form of moral impetus for the governments to want to act. We think that's the problem. But secondly, we need to understand that this, even if they want to talk about Maldives and Mauritius, this debate expands to many other countries, because the very same signal you will send to all forms of countries is extremely bad. When it comes to any kind of situation, aid, money, we think countries like South Africa have a perpetual problem with dependency itself. Fact is, they completely rely on the fact that it is someone else's job to make sure that their problems get wiped out, that their problems necessarily get assuaged and alleviated. And that's a fundamental problem. But that level of culture of dependency will naturally extend to the fact that it is now someone else's duty to clean up our own mess. And this kind of normative message necessarily sends out that very same signal to any country that wants to go through that industrialization process. What happens then is that it reduces the kind, or it gives you the kind of inertia to have to try to make or give you an incentive to have any form of organic change in the process, in your models, in your duty of care towards people, in deprioritizing economic gain over the lives and the climate combat that you necessarily need to do. And we think for the sake of a global solution, you need not make that concession. That concession is extremely detrimental. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for his speech and now call upon for the last speech for government side, government whip.
Side opposition personifies our leadership today. Dilly-dallying for too long, saying that change will come sometime and it's not an immediate problem, and talking of a sustainable solution without giving us one. I'm going to look at this debate under three major issues. I'm going to look at the principal justification. Secondly, I'm going to look at what, in fact, impact does it have on the developing countries or the poorer countries. Lastly, I'm going to look at the effect it has on the industrialized world. So let's move on first to the principal justification. And we clearly prove to you that, look, the harm to a large extent has been caused by the actions of these developed countries, which means you can't run away from the simple scientific fact that the carbon dioxide that these countries put into the atmosphere is largely responsible for the rising sea levels or any sort of climate change that comes about and that affects the island nations here, which means your responsibility is to a large extent there. But let us for a minute assume but not concede that they didn't have a major part of the responsibility. we still think then on the humanitarian principle of saving lives where it is must, that you must accept these people. And it's a complete assertion to tell me that islands in the Mauritius and Maldives are not drowning at this very minute.
So,
We think the immediacy of problem is something that they simply shied away from. We think then on that very principle we stand. Because we told you that is always the criteria we have applied. Which means when people are dying for no fault of theirs, we have always helped them out of the situation. Something that opening referred to in their speeches. They never caught on with that. But more than that, all that they told us was, look, the principle should be a sustainable solution. Beyond that, nothing. But even with that, the problem is our policy is not mutually exclusive in having a sustainable solution in those countries. Which means that it's possible completely to have some sort of policy implemented there, which I'll talk of in my substantive, and yet accept the immediate ones whose lives are in danger. We think that is what they missed in this debate. But I want to move on to the more important question here. What is the impact that it has on these poorer or developing countries? So they told us that, look, poorer countries will never realize the consequences of their action, or have never realized, and hence they are more responsible. We say no. It's exactly the West that perpetuates the idea that immediate economic gain and some ideas of social xenophobia are way more important than environmental concerns. We think it's the West that's been perpetuating this idea, and we think exactly that's what India and China are going to learn when they see the West always put the debt and always put development ahead of the environmental crisis. We think then you can't blame poorer countries who aren't able to feed half their population for doing what they do when they see the West do this. Please sit down. But more than that, they told us a compromise will never be reached. But it's very simple, and that's where my extension speech came in. We told you it helps us gain political capital. How? Because now we have a bargaining chip to tell them, look, for too long you have been accusing us of not doing nothing, but now that we have taken some action, this means that it's imperative that you take some as well. We think that is the sort of moral high ground that puts us then to force these countries to take some action. That puts us in a position to force these countries to take that sort of carbon dioxide cutting measures that we want them to take. We think only talk and only attending good conferences, Copenhagen and Kyoto, hasn't helped the cause this long. We think as long as the poorer countries see the West as hypocrisies like George Bush, who just wants to save his economic might and not care of the environment, we don't think the poorer countries are going to take any sort of action. Please sit down. But then Germany had to tell us that they will only absolve the responsibility, which means the poor countries will be extremely happy to ship people away. We say no. That's again where my extension speaker was involved, because he told you that people always will prefer to live in their own land. Which means people have the natural incentive to force their governments to bring about some policy change. But when their governments are in no position or absolutely unable to do something, we think then it's the West's imperative to take some action. And given that poorer countries are in no position or don't have the same sort of technology to deal with the problems that they are facing, we think then it's your imperative to take the immediate action. That does not mean then that it's a mutually exclusive solution. I see people weighing around Shweta.
It's nice of you to say that all clean energy and stuff is not mutually exclusive from your end, but all industrialized nations lose any political will to spend money in these areas when you force them to take climate change refugees.
That's when I come to my third point of this debate. But before I move on, the very last thing then, how does this political capital help us? It helps us then to impose on these countries the environmental standards that we think they need. Why is that important? Because if you look at the future of the world, it's India, China and these developing countries who are going to be the major polluters. Now the fact is, if they don't clean up their act at this very moment, it's only going to cause the vicious cycle of more pollution and more climate change. We think then by showing them that we are ready to change, hence you must also bring some sort of change, is the positive message that we want to send out these countries so that they change. We think that then is some sort of sustainable solution that our side presented, something that they never got on to. Please sit down. I then move on to my third point of this debate. Why then, or what then is the impact on the industrialized nations? Because we tell you then what happens today in these industrialized countries is there's a culture of cool talk, which means it's okay then to be very cool of green talk and then to join organizations and protest outside buildings. We think what is happening now is that people in these countries don't feel the pinch of their own actions, which means there's no direct incentive to take any sort of measures because this is all talk, it does not affect your everyday life. I think that is the problem then. Before I run out of time, Kanna.
If you think that it's a humanitarian response that we need to give, then you failed in your burden, because that is not limited to just industrialized nations. The responsibility to protect lies with everyone.
Two responses to that. One, in principle he agrees that sovereignty is not the same principle that Jeremy wanted to talk of. But two, it's a very practical consideration. Which means if the US and Europe have more GDP per capita, it's naturally then that they'll take more than poorer countries who can't afford to feed their own citizens. The practicalities of that means that we have to force the Western liberal countries, democracies to take it. But more than that, we don't think India and China have been to the same extent responsible for the carbon dioxide emissions that Western liberal democracies have. We think 3 levels why then they should be forced. But what's the impact on industrialized countries? We tell you legislative change within these countries will only come when people start to think that this is something important. And how does that work? In status quo, it's fine to see movies and then to attend talks on environmental change. But that hasn't affected us to the same way which affects when you see people in your own neighborhood, when you see people in your own countries who have come from outside, have their lives torn apart by climate change. We think that is when it incentivizes you to force the governments to bring about some sort of change in your own countries. Especially in light of how the US and EU have started to put the environment on the back burner and look only at economic policies, we think it's extremely important that people on the ground and governments in these countries start to bring about that sort of change. We think that is when our policy works in developed countries as well. So in this debate, we have told you 3 things. We have told you it's principally the burden that the West has to take for the reasons outlined. We told you secondly then that it has a positive change in developing countries, something that's a sort of sustainable solution they wanted us to present, they never did themselves. But thirdly, we told you there's a positive impact in developed countries as well when people on the ground see the sort of problems that happen and force governments to change. We are very proud to take this debate.
I thank the government whip for his speech and call upon for the final speech for the quarterfinals, the opposition.
Speaker, now what we see in this debate is that under both paradigms we want to solve the problem, which is people are dying due to climate change, and that is a problem that the both sides actually want to solve. And by actually when we look at this problem, I feel that the first question I want to ask is that under which paradigm does this problem really get solved, right? What we see from the opening, what we see from the government side is that their idea of actually taking these countries that are affected by climate change and by actually removing the people that are affected and putting them in another country somehow solves this problem of people dying due to climate change. And we think that that is not exactly a sustainable solution, because let me tell you, because by actually removing them, right, you're actually not solving the problem of people dying, because ultimately climate change is still there. Climate change is still going to affect the global arena, and people are still going to die anyway, because you're not taking a concrete step in removing climate change, in actually delaying climate change, right? And by what we are doing here, by not forcing countries to accept these people into not forcing these industrialized countries to accept people, we're actually giving these developing countries, which are the current, we are the biggest stakeholders right now in further perpetuating climate change. Because right now we have the technological information, we have the technological advancements to know that to actually know that these type of energy, what type of energy is actually the best to actually combat climate change. There's a lot of possibilities, there are a lot of technological advances such as green energy and a lot of clean fuels they can use, and these developing countries are the ones with the information, with the current capability to do so, and with the greater, they are the greater stakeholders in the global arena in terms of producing all this waste and in terms of actually further perpetuating the climate change. And we feel that these are the people, this is how we combat the problem, this is how we tackle climate change, and this is exactly how we solve the problem. So when we look at how, under which paradigm the problem itself is solved, we feel that the opposition knows how to do it, right? And that's why we feel that it should go to the closing, especially to the closing opposition. Now moving on to how this actually brings about more positive benefits to the world and to these developing countries, right? The closing government actually came up and said how there's actually a political capital on how capitalize on that, and how that's going to bring about a lot of benefits. Now, what we're saying is that political policies rarely come with no strings attached, and believing that these countries, these industrialized countries, are going to do this on an altruistic purpose is completely fantastical, and we don't think that is going to happen at a pragmatic level, because not all industrialized countries will have no vested interest in their policies. And what kind of countries are we talking about? We're talking about industrialized countries, countries which are rich, countries which actually have a lot of capability, and coming into developing countries, actually taking the people over. I mean, we think that the political capital that they are talking about can rarely exist without any vested interest, and that itself actually a harm, and we think that they're actually perpetuating the problem, and they're not really solving anything here, right? And moving on to my second clash on how the idea of under which paradigm do we exactly mitigate the problem better. Now, looking at what side government talked about was that how they are going to send this message of how the first world countries are the ones that actually contribute most to the problem, and hence they have an added impetus, they have an added obligation to actually take up this, the stance and actually take up the lead in actually combating climate change. And we feel that is completely a bollocks, because the climate change is not only affecting the first world countries, it's a global problem. So who should so everyone has a clear and equal stake in it, and why should we only just give the this added moral obligation to the first world countries? We don't see any point in that. Just because at that time of your advancement you couldn't see, because of the lack of technological advancement, that you are not able to foresee in the future that you're going to cause harm, it doesn't mean that you have the onus to actually come up and take up the added moral obligation, the added impetus to actually spearhead this climate change, to actually spearhead this policy, right? And the fact that actually you are actually going to spearhead this actually is fueling this hypocrisy that actually fueling the state hypocrisy, actually, because right now people are going to view, right now developing countries are going to view you as someone who actually conceded to the fact that the problem is you, and the problem is yours, and you have started the problem. And we think that is something that's problematic, because not only are you giving them a backseat in regarding the blame, they are also giving them the idea that, you know what, the problem is ours, so we have the onus to deal with this. And we think that is detrimental, especially given the fact that developing countries are the biggest stakeholders in further perpetuating climate change. Before I move on, yes, sorry.
Man, given that talks are constantly stalled because first world countries have their own interests at hand, tell us how, by taking the hardest and worst hit refugees of these countries, are going to drastically change the entire process and lose all impetus for negotiations.
So, we clearly know that by actually allowing these first world countries to actually taking these refugees, right, you're actually going to further stall the negotiation and not the other way around. Because let me tell you what, when these first world countries want to negotiate, when these first world countries want to propose certain policy, right now they are going to be more problematic, because number one, the people that they're negotiating with, which is the rest of the world, which of course which now believes that the problem is started by the first world countries, which believe that the most onus to take initiative lies with the first world countries, are not going to be very responsive, are not going to be very cooperative when the first world countries when the first world countries even bring this issue to negotiations, right? Because right now you're putting the first world countries in the backseat by actually disadvantaging them, by putting the blame on them, and we feel that that is going to stall the negotiations further and not the other way around, because the problem is further getting worse under your paradigm, and we feel that is detrimental to the problem itself, because climate change, number one, will never be combated, because you're going to delay the process of negotiations, you're going to delay the process of these countries wanting to have an incentive to find out proper green technologies, and we think that's going to further perpetuate the problem that is people dying around the world. Now, furthermore, right, the closing government also talked about how these there's going to be this added xenophobia and people dying and xenophobia, and they actually kind of weight people dying and xenophobia on the same scale, and they said that actually, they said that people dying is an even dire problem. Now we certainly agree, people dying is a more dire problem, and under any humanitarian obligation, we know that these countries, and we know that in the global arena has an impetus to act on it and to act on any humanitarian grounds. But the problem they fail to characterize is that people are not dying right now. As Kana has brought up, it's not a short-term. Their policy is not a short-term progress. It's
it's not a short-term solution to our problem that we see. So with all that, we're proud to host.
Oh, well. Cheers. Cheers. Hey, why are we talking about beer?
It's already in the Sayed lab.
We'll just get this.
I needed the same job.
Yeah, you need bread.
No, I needed pasties.
Sorry?
I needed
Oh.
pasties. Actually, have you got red pen now?
Yeah. Do you have an idea?
Sorry, that again.
I think I'll just turn around. Okay, what did you guys give it to?
I've got it as a government train.
Government? I thought it would be an opening house. I thought OO and then OG.
That was where my contention was between those two.
For me, it was an opening with as well.
Can we just be clear, we're not putting them through because of the whip speech, basically?
Yeah.
Can you just get status? Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.